So I'm Ervin Bullock, and I'm sitting here on the purple bench with Joe Marx, a friend. and I've asked him to share his story, but let me just tell you that Joe has worked with Compassionate St. Augustine. He's done an initiative called Golden Way, Films That Make a Difference, and they have panels with the films. And he's also the founder and organizer of the St. Augustine Film Society. Now, Joe, if I've said anything that's not exactly right, correct me.
No, that's right on.
That's what I know about you. And so I've asked him to share a little bit about his family story and his own story. And I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
Okay, so, and jump in with questions anytime. So
Okay.
the family history really is pretty detailed. My mother has a cousin in California who is the family genealogist, who every vacation time that she had would go to Salt Lake City and do research at the Mormon Library because they keep records on everybody. So our family really gets traced back to Toledo, Spain in the 15th century.
Wow.
And they fled Spain during the Inquisition, 1492. They leave for France and spend a couple of hundred years in France, and then for reasons I really don't know, in 1753 relocate to Germany. Great call. So my mother has a real normal childhood, middle class, upper middle class upbringing. The family owns a city block in Frankfurt that has stores on the ground floor, a stable, a butcher shop, and apartments above the stores. They live in one of the apartments. It was a really good upbringing, and then Hitler came to power. And after the Nuremberg laws were put into place, it was not a good time for Jews. My mother's side of the family is a pretty large family, lots of different cousins. One of her cousins fled in 1935, which was pretty early. He probably was the smartest of the bunch. He fled to Lima, Peru in 1935 and set up a chemical business there, became very prosperous. My mother had another cousin branch of the family that were able to get out around the same time my mother did, and they went to Havana, Cuba. So we have family in Havana. And the United States had a very, very strict quota policy at the time. I think they only allowed 25,000 or 28,000 Jews from Europe into the U.S. at any given year. And you needed to have someone, usually another family member, in the United States who would sign an affidavit listing their assets and certify that this family that was now going to be immigrating to the United States would not become a burden, a financial burden on the United States.
And this was in the late 30s? Is that the
So,
period we're talking about?
Yes. So my mother's family had applied for visas early on in 1938.
Okay.
And then November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, when large pogroms broke out throughout Germany. The synagogues were burned, the shops were looted, really, really horrible stuff went on. And my mother's family was still in Germany at the time, but they had their exit visas. But my mother's father and her grandfather were arrested by the Gestapo on Kristallnacht, taken to Buchenwald. My grandmother had to go the following day and plead with them to release her husband and her father, and showed them the exit documents. Actually, about 3,000 Jews, I think, were released from Buchenwald at that time. So they say, we're leaving, we're out of here, you don't have to worry about us, we're going to the United States, please let us go. They were only allowed to leave with essentially about $10 per person. The city block in Frankfurt They sold to their maid for about $100. So she did really well. And so my mother, her brother, who was 4 years older, and her parents came to New York and lived with relatives in New York until they were able to establish themselves. My mother started high school at Washington Irving High School. She was 15 at the time, and pursued a art career. She became a textile designer of children's clothing. And her brother went into the garment industry. So that's how my mother got here. My father lived in a small farming village called Schriesheim. Very, very small village. I think maybe 1,000 people total. And he had 2 older brothers. So my father and the middle brother were able to get a relative in the United States to sign an affidavit, so they were able to get into the United States. His parents and his older brother went to the Union of South Africa, where they lived until about 1959, 1960, and the political situation there became very bad. So my father then had to sign an affidavit that his older brother wouldn't be a burden, and he was able to get them into the United States. So it was still necessary, even as late as 1960, to have an anchor in the United States to get here. There was a cousin that fled to Israel. There was one of the cousins who was very young, was put on what is called a kinder transport, where some families would just try to at least save the children because they knew what was coming, or were at least fearful of it. And he went to the UK and lived in a small farming village north of London. One cousin went to Australia. One part of the family went to China because there was an agreement with China would take Jews relatively easily, and because they wanted to develop Shanghai as a business community, and the Jews that went to Shanghai actually were taken in by the residents. The situation there was fine, and they survived the war in China, built businesses, and then that branch of the family eventually made their way to the United States also. So that's
your family, it was a diaspora of itself.
It was a mad dash to get out of Europe.
Yeah.
One cousin went to France and wound up surviving the war in France, although things weren't that great in France either, ultimately, after Germany marched through there. My mother has one cousin, wasn't able to get out, and she and her younger brother, who was 7 at the time, she was about 14, and her parents were sent to Theresienstadt, which is one of the better concentration camps. It was the show camp. It was the camp where the Red Cross was brought to show them how wonderful things were. They'd bring in bands and have music playing, and they'd set up soccer matches or whatever. Wasn't great. I have been to Theresienstadt.
I have too, yeah.
It's not great. It's not summer camp.
No.
It was pretty horrible. And then in 1944, they were shipped to Auschwitz. My mother's cousin survived, but her brother and her parents were killed immediately on arrival. The reason that cousin couldn't get into the United States, her father had some disability with one of his arms, so he was an invalid, and so they couldn't get into, regardless of anybody signing an affidavit, he was not getting into the United States. So that's kind of the thumbnail sketch of my family's diaspora.
When we talked earlier, you mentioned how trauma gets into your DNA. What do you see as?
Okay, so I was brought up with a father who was thrown out of his country that he loved, and a mother who was thrown out of her country, which she loved, and they actually made I think it might be 3 trips back to Germany. Germany, in their wisdom, tried to at least make up for some of the trauma by inviting those that survived and wanted to return to their villages or whatever, and have celebrations and discussions with the residents about what it was like living in Germany during those times, so that the population would learn and hopefully never repeat those mistakes. Germany has created this program of what are called Stoppelstein. It's tripping stones.
Oh, I've heard of that, yeah.
Okay, they're about 4-inch square plaques that are embedded in the sidewalk in front of the houses that were taken, stolen, I don't know what word you want to use, but that with the Jews who were there, it has the name, the date they were born, the date they either left Germany or the date they went to concentration camp in front of all of these houses.
And does your family have?
I do, and one of the books that I brought has a picture of the Stoppelstein in it.
Wow.
So.
Wow. Well, one of the reasons that I wanted to do this is I really feel like we've got to build understanding and respect, and we come from a lot of different situations, but I think when we share our stories, that we begin to understand each other a little better. I wonder, Joe, if there's anything that you would really want us to know, maybe about Judaism, maybe about just how this shaped you.
Okay, so, I mean, that's a real overarching question, but anti-Semitism, which is making a big comeback, but has never disappeared anyplace, has been with us for a long, long time, and what happens is, the reason that it stays around so long is that whatever culture we are part of, the anti-Semites say that we are 180 degrees opposite of what their culture reveres. So in Russia, Jews are all dirty capitalists. In the United States, we're all filthy communists. We can't win.
So it's a scapegoat kind of thing.
It is. I don't know if it's a combination of jealousy. We're an easy target. There's not many of us. We have this reputation of being moneylenders. That was created by the church, which made it not sinful, but exchanging money was at the displeasure of the church. Give it to the Jews, let them do it, and that's how that reputation got started. Gee, I'm sorry, we're good at it?
Yeah. The other thing I've heard from a rabbi friend of mine was that during one period, Jews weren't allowed to be farmers, to have the agrarian farms, and so had to be merchants. Have you heard that?
No, but we tended to be merchants, go into retail, banking, those kinds of endeavors. But part of my family in Germany, my father's family were agrarian. Part of my mother's family, one was a butcher.
Right. So
they weren't doctors and lawyers.
Yeah. Right.
What would I want people to know about Judaism?
Yeah.
It's the first monotheistic religion that everything else is based on. All of the advances of, wow, that's going to sound terrible, but it's where everything started. It's where civilization, a meaningful, humanitarian, compassionate civilization started from. And what has happened is people who view religion in the extreme have corrupted whatever good we have tried to do.
We're all dealing with that in our own faith groups, I think. But I sense that there's a real pride for the things that y'all have brought in terms of ethics and justice and humanitarian caring and civilization.
I mean, I guess it's embedded in my DNA. Part of the reason for forming the Golden Way Films That Make a Difference. First off, films are a powerful educating tool, but it's to create a more compassionate, friendly, healthy, safe environment in St. Augustine. That's why I do what I do.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you sharing this with us, Joe, and let's hope it helps.
That
That's
would
all
be
we can hope.
that would be my hope.